which we've covered previously. The first of those location controls with respect to this case is that of its relationship to other special regulated uses. Again, if this use were located within the 1,000-foot proximity of 4 or more existing special regulated uses, then a location waiver would be necessary for approval. In this case, there are only 2 such uses within 1,000 feet. The first, Liquor One, a liquor store located at 1701 South Mission Street to the north of this site. And the second, The Store, a liquor store located to the south of this property at 2128 South Mission Street. The second location criteria is described in the second slide on page 10, has to do with the location of the proposed use relative to properties that are residentially zoned or used as mobile home parks, K-12 schools, civic spaces, churches, or cemeteries. In reviewing this property in a 300-foot buffer around it, staff finds that there are no properties that are in any of those categories within 300 feet. As a result of the 2 findings I just covered, no location waiver is required in this instance. Once again, during staff's review of the property and the site plan of record for the property, we found 2 items that are included in your recommendation tonight. The first is that the site currently has a dumpster that sits out in the open on the south side of the building without any enclosure. The second is that there's existing non-conforming gravel parking on the site. Again, this parking is also located south of the existing convenience store building, closer to Broomfield Street and adjacent to the ABC warehouse parking lot. As part of staff's conditions tonight, in association with this special use permit, staff's recommending that those 2 items be addressed. So with that, staff's recommendation is to approve the special use permit with those 2 conditions as described. And we have the applicant here to answer any questions you might have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane? Is anyone going to have questions for the applicant? Then we won't have the applicant come up. And I will open public comment if anyone wants to comment. Seeing no one, I'm closing public comment, opening discussion.
Move to approve SUP 1913, subject to the following conditions. 1, the applicant provide a code-compliant dumpster enclosure. 2, the existing gravel parking spaces will be removed and lawn restored.
I second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is TC 1906. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our final public hearing tonight is a ordinance to regulate recreational or adult use medical marijuana facilities in the city. And this presentation will begin on page 12. If at any point I lose you or you lose me in where I'm at in this presentation, please interrupt. This is all just a little bit unusual, so I don't want to take for granted that I'm not passing over anything. And certainly if you have questions as we go, again, because of the complexity of this particular ordinance and the issue in general, feel free to interrupt if that's all right, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to take any questions as we go. So first, to provide some background on the item before you, in November of 2018, voters in the state of Michigan passed the MRTMA, which is the state law which regulates and basically creates a commercial marketplace for recreational marijuana and standards for establishments that will sell, grow, process, and test recreational marijuana in the state of Michigan. It also does some other things related to the legality of possession and growing in your personal property marijuana, which we won't get into tonight as those aren't related to the establishments and the zoning in this particular issue. The MRTMA creates 6 establishment types, which are retailers, processors, safety compliance facilities, secure transporters, 3 classes of growers, A, B, and C. Those differ by the number of plants that are permitted to be grown, with 500 for class, 200 for class A, 500 for class B, and 2,000 for class C, and then micro businesses. You'll recall if from our discussion on medical marijuana facilities, many of these terms are going to look familiar. The 2 new ones would be retailers. This is a establishment type that's more or less equivalent to a provisioning center as established under the medical marijuana law. And then micro businesses. Micro businesses are establishments that can grow, process, and sell marijuana within one establishment. those establishments can only grow, process, and sell marijuana, or I should say, they can only process and sell marijuana that's grown as a part of the business. So it's not a business type that allows for outside products to be brought in and sold. The Marijuana Regulatory Agency is the state agency that oversees licensing for medical and recreational marijuana facilities and establishments. They're planning to begin accepting applications for recreational marijuana establishment licenses on November 1st of this year. So on page 13, the city commission adopted a regulatory ordinance. That is an ordinance that would opt in to allow certain recreational marijuana facility or establishments within the city and create some parameters for that on September 9th of this year. That regulatory ordinance calls on the city to begin accepting license applications on January 6th of next year. It establishes an annual license fee of $5,000 for those licenses, and it also establishes a competitive selection process for establishments that are subject to numerical limits under the ordinance. So you may recall that with the medical marijuana regulatory ordinance the City Commission adopted, we used a lottery process for the selection of those facilities that were subject to numeric limits. The MRTMA does not permit municipalities to use a random selection process. It requires a competitive process, and the City Commission responded by creating a competitive scoring process to make those selections. On the second slide on page 13, you'll see an overview of the type of establishments that regulatory ordinance permits. It would allow up to 3 retailers, up to 5 Class A growers, and up to 3 Class B or C growers. The ordinance allows up to 3 Class C licenses to be stacked per Class C growing establishment. So if we had 3 Class C facilities licensed in the city, each of those facilities could have up to 3 Class C licenses in operation at that facility for a total of 9 Class C licenses in the city. The ordinance would allow an unlimited number of processors, an unlimited number of safety compliance facilities, an unlimited number of secure transporters, and 2 micro businesses. The main departure in these establishment numbers from what's allowed under the medical marijuana ordinance is that number for micro businesses, because there's not an equivalent license type under the medical marijuana law.
Jacob?
Yes, sir.
Does the if you do have 2 micro businesses, that takes out of the running, because they're retailers, yes?
There's a totally separate license type. So that would be in addition to the 3 retailers licenses that would be available.
Thank you.
The regulatory ordinance establishes that all establishments will be subject to a special use permit approval from the Planning Commission.
I'm sorry. What is a zero excess? Well, what is an excess marijuana grower?
So an excess marijuana grower is a category that was created under the state's promulgated rules for marijuana establishments. So the MRTMA is the state law that was adopted by voters in November. Subsequent to that law calls upon the state licensing agency to adopt rules that will govern the licensing process. And through that licensing process, the MRA, the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, there's a lot of acronyms in this world, they established a license type called excess grower, which is basically a circumstance where you are operating many growing licenses in one property, one establishment. The number of stacked licenses is not capped by state law, but the city's regulatory ordinance does limit that to 3, which is below the threshold that would be needed to hit the excess grower license category under state law. So essentially it becomes a moot issue because we can't get there under either our medical or our recreational ordinances. That's a good question. On page 14, I've provided an overview of the special use permit criteria that are proposed for these establishments. Those include standards for lighting, the storage and disposal of marijuana, signage, odor, buffering from nearby properties, establishing limits on location relative to K-12 schools with a 1,000-foot minimum buffer from those properties, a buffer for the SDU University District of 500 feet. That would be the principal campus of Central Michigan University, and that is unless a property is located east of the university and also east of Mission Street. And then finally, operational and building standards for each establishment type. The second slide on page 14 outlines the locations where these establishments would be permitted under the proposed ordinance. Retailers would be permitted in the CD4 or CD5 zoning districts if they were also located within either the Central Business District TIFA or the Mission Pickard DDA. And they would also be allowed in the SCI Industrial District only if they were co-located with a licensed grower or processor. The other 5 facility types as under the proposed ordinance would only be permitted in that SDI industrial district. As I mentioned before, much of the regulations in this ordinance, the vast majority are identical to those that Oak City currently has in effect under our zoning ordinance for medical marijuana facilities. On page 15 at the top, you'll see a map. This is the buffer map that was used during the adoption process of the medical marijuana ordinance. Under the terms of the proposed ordinance before you tonight, the same buffers and zoning requirements would be implemented for medical or for recreational marijuana establishments as were implemented for medical marijuana facilities. You'll see in blue the border of the Mission and Pickard DDA, in pink the borders of the Central Business District Tax Increment Finance Authority District. In tan are properties that are either K through 12 schools in the community or properties zoned SDU as part of the main campus of the university, and the appropriate buffers that would be applied to those properties to restrict the location of these establishments. And then finally, I would call it brown or rust color. You'll see properties that are located within our industrial district. So it's just to give you a sense of location eligibility under the proposed ordinance, which is again identical to the location availability that was provided under the medical marijuana facilities zoning ordinance. So with that, I would welcome any questions. The recommendation and the action requested tonight is for the Planning Commission to recommend adoption of this text change at a future meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Any questions for Mr. Payne?
I'm interested that, I guess it's not a question, retailers shall not allow the sale, consumption, or use of alcohol or tobacco products on the premises. I mean, it says clearly you can't smoke marijuana. I'm just wondering, I think, smoking is an abhorrent addiction, but I don't know why people can't smoke when they go to these places. And you don't have an answer for that?
No, other than in general terms, the Michigan Clean Air Act more or less prohibits tobacco smoking indoors at facilities already, so it would be consistent with existing state law.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Mr. Payne? I will open up public comment if anyone would like to come up. Seeing no one, I'm closing public comment and opening discussion.
Recommend that the city commission adopt TC 1906.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is public comment. If anyone from the public would like to speak, that would be the last opportunity to do so. Seeing no one, I'm closing public comment, and next item on the agenda is new business, presentation of the master plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have Paul Lippins here tonight from McKenna & Associates to provide you with an update on the city's 70% draft master plan. You all received a copy of that in your packet this month, and as you know, it is also available on the project website, mtpleasant2050.com. We also do, for those who are interested, have hard copies of the plan available for review, both in the planning office at City Hall as well as at the Veterans Memorial Library. So for those who would be interested in a more tactile review experience, we do have those documents available at those locations. I'll turn it over to Paul.
All right, so good evening, Commission. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. I'm gonna use my PowerPoint to just make sure that I cover the information that we wanted to talk about. Hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to review the plan. Very excited that we have a plan on the website. We call it a 70% plan to basically indicate that this is an adoptable plan. It's a complete draft, but before we enter the adoption process, we want to provide a presentation to the commissions. I presented to the DDA, the Parks Commission, right before your meeting tonight, and then I'll be at City Commission on the 14th. What we're asking is for you to provide your comments, thoughts, observations on the draft material to your staff representative. We've been working with staff to develop this draft